People who have been wrongly accused of a crime sometimes say they're looking forward to having their day in court. In other words, they're looking forward to having the truth to be revealed and justice to be served. They're looking forward to having their good names to be vindicated. Well, as we recall, Paul had his day in court under the governor Felix, but nothing good came of it. Felix didn't even pronounce a verdict. Paul was kept in confinement for 2 years after his trial. Finally, the day came again for Paul to have another day in court. A new governor was in charge, a man named Festus. And so Paul would have one more chance to have his case heard and to have his name cleared. And so we pick up the story as Festus is a newly appointed governor of Judea, and he decides to take a public relations trip to the city of Jerusalem. And we see the story in Acts 25. 3 days after arriving in the province, Festus went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and the Jewish leaders appeared before him and presented the charges against Paul. They requested Festus, as a favor to them, to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem, for they were preparing an ambush to kill him along the way. Festus answered, "Paul is being held at Caesarea, and I myself am going there soon. Let some of your leaders come with me, and if the man has done anything wrong, they can press charges against him there." So Felix is out of the picture. And as we recall, Felix was the governor of Judea who Paul appeared before. Felix held Paul captive for 2 years without even making any kind of a decision in Paul's case. Acts 24:26 tells us that one of the reasons that Felix kept Paul around was that he was hoping that Paul would bribe him. And that gives us a little bit of insight into Felix's character, or lack of it. He was open to bribes. His moral compass was broken. He was dishonest and unfair and immoral and cruel. He felt he was above the law because of his influence with the courts. So the Jews had had enough. The Jewish officials made numerous accusations against Felix, and there was unrest in the land, with a group of revolutionaries rising up, known as the Sicarii, a word that means assassins. On one hand, you have Felix having violently squashing rebellions and even having high priests killed. On the other hand, Felix refuses to give a verdict on the case regarding Paul, instead meeting with him often to see if Paul would bribe him. Finally, not only had the Jews had enough, Rome had enough as well. And so they replaced him with Festus. Well, Festus was not perfect, but he was far better than Felix. Josephus wrote that Festus ruled wisely and justly. He was able to eliminate the Sicarii bandits and calm down the disturbances that erupted under Felix's rule. So as soon as he is appointed governor of Judea, we see Festus taking a trip to Jerusalem. The Jewish officials, they're high maintenance, and Festus no doubt knew that their unhappiness led to Felix losing his position as governor. So he's going to Jerusalem in order to get things started off on the right foot. The Jewish officials wasted no time in bringing up charges against Paul. The officials had to be frustrated by Felix's inaction. Paul wasn't pronounced innocent or guilty. He just stayed in Herod's palace in Caesarea. The Jewish leaders were not happy that a verdict had not been reached. And they weren't happy that the only thing that happened to Paul was just captivity in Herod's palace. Their wrath toward Paul had not been tempered, and they were still determined to see him dead. Since Festus was new on the job, he probably wasn't really familiar with the case. So the Jewish leaders started from square one, bringing up charges against Paul. Well, Festus listened to their complaint, perhaps hearing about Paul for the first time. But then the Jewish leaders tried something new. They asked Festus for a change of venue for the trial. They would like to have the trial moved to Jerusalem. Well, this kind of request wasn't really unheard of. Perhaps they tried to convince Festus that since the charges against Paul pertained to Jewish law, it would be advantageous to bring him to Jerusalem where all the Jewish law experts were located. However, they really never intended for Paul to stand trial in Jerusalem. Their request hid a sinister plan to have Paul ambushed and killed as he traveled from Caesarea to Jerusalem. This is interesting because it's the exact same thing they tried to do a couple years earlier when Paul was first arrested in Jerusalem. And there, Lysias was the Roman commander, and Paul was held in the Antonia fortress next to the temple. 40 men visited with the Jewish leaders, presenting a plan to have Paul killed. And in this plan, the Jewish leaders would request that he send Paul to the Sanhedrin in the temple so that they could question him. But on the way, the 40 men planned to ambush him and kill Paul. But word of the plan got back to Lysias. So instead of sending him to the Sanhedrin, he sent him to Caesarea under heavy guard. Well, evidently, the Jewish leaders had come up with no new ideas because they planned to try the very same thing when Paul was being transported to Jerusalem for trial. We're not told who's going to do the ambushing, but it's likely it's the very same 40 men who intended to carry out the plan earlier. They know that Paul will be guarded by Roman soldiers. And they know that by ambushing Paul, some of them will be killed by the soldiers. But in their minds, it'll all be worth it just to have Paul killed. The Jewish leaders must have known that their case was extremely weak. First, because they weren't telling the truth, and they had no witnesses to the charges that were brought against Paul. If they really wanted Paul dead, their best chance was to ambush him. The trial under Felix had not found Paul guilty, and there's a good chance that a new trial would not either. Festus declined the request, and he surely didn't know anything about the planned ambush. His reason to decline the request was logical. Paul was already confined in Caesarea. Festus, he was on his way back to Caesarea, so it just makes sense to leave Paul there and try him there as Festus returns. So Festus issues a friendly invitation for the leaders to accompany him to Caesarea. And we pick it up in verse 6. After spending 8 or 10 days with them, Festus went down to Caesarea. The next day he convened the court and ordered that Paul be brought before him. When Paul came in, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him. They brought many serious charges against him, but they could not prove them. So Festus spent over a week in Jerusalem. And during that time, he probably continued to meet with the Jewish leaders, trying to understand them, trying to gain their trust. He definitely had a different style than Felix. And we wonder during these 8 or 10 days in Jerusalem, how many times the name of Paul was brought up. There's a good chance that the leaders did their best to paint a picture of Paul as a dangerous revolutionary who was a direct threat to Caesar. It would be to their advantage if they could poison the pot before the official trial began in Caesarea. Well, once Festus arrived in Caesarea, he wasted no time to bring Paul to trial. Festus probably got a good meal and a good night's sleep to prepare himself for the next day. And on that day, he convened the court and let the Jewish leaders state their case against Paul. Obviously, having Paul's trial so soon was a favor to the Jews. Paul's case was moved up to the first spot on Festus's docket. Well, the Jews brought up the same charges against Paul that they had with Felix. It was deja vu all over again. The leaders brought up several charges against Paul, probably the same grievances they had against him 2 years earlier, that Paul had abandoned Jewish law and defiled the temple. And just like 2 years previous, they could not prove the charges. They couldn't prove the charges because the charges simply were not true. And just as with the previous trial, They just threw everything against the wall to see what might stick. It's interesting that this time there's no mention of a lawyer who was representing their case before Festus. In the earlier trial before Felix, a lawyer named Tertullus represented their interests, but now no lawyer is even mentioned. Kind of makes you wonder, could it be that their case was so weak that they couldn't even get a lawyer to go with them to Caesarea to represent them? We pick it up in verse 8. Then Paul made his defense. I have done nothing wrong against the Jewish law or against the temple or against Caesar. Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges? Paul answered, I am now standing before Caesar's court, where I ought to be tried. I have not done any wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well. If, however, I am guilty of doing anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. After Festus had conferred with his council, he declared, you have appealed to Caesar you will go. So Paul denied the charges just as he did at the first trial. And in his denial, Paul includes he has done nothing wrong against Caesar. Evidently, the Jewish leaders were trying to convince Festus that Paul was a troublemaker who started up riots and incited the people to revolt against the emperor. This is the charge that Festus would be most interested in. Revolts against Caesar were not tolerated. It was a serious charge that could lead to his execution. This charge is very similar to the one that Paul faced in Thessalonica on his second missionary journey. In that town, Paul's enemies were trying to bring him to court, but they couldn't find him. So they dragged Jason to court instead. Paul had been staying in Jason's house while in Thessalonica. And in front of the city officials, they said, these men who have caused trouble all over the world have now come here, and Jason has welcomed them into his house. They are all defying Caesar's decrees, saying that there is another king, one called Jesus. Well, of course, Paul did preach about Christ's kingdom, but Christ's kingdom was a spiritual kingdom and was no threat to Caesar. But by twisting Paul's words around, they hoped that the officials would condemn Paul. And obviously now, the Jewish officials are trying the same strategy, doing the same thing before Festus. Well, Festus thought it might be a good idea, after all, to move Paul's trial to Jerusalem. He wanted to do this as a favor to the Jews. The Jews had earlier asked him for this favor, and now Festus seems ready to grant it. So why the change of heart? Well, maybe because in these court proceedings, he observed that there was growing frustration and high emotion by the Jewish leaders. He knew they could be difficult, and he really wanted a better relationship with them than Felix had. And so he may have thought, what harm can come from it? He also may have thought, as Lucius had earlier, that he wasn't really very well versed in Jewish law. The Sanhedrin were the experts on Jewish law, and they were located in Jerusalem. So he may have even thought that he was doing Paul a favor by giving him a fair trial in Jerusalem, since the Jewish law could be interpreted more precisely there. And so he asked Paul if he was willing for the trial to be moved. He assured Paul that he would still be standing trial before him. He wasn't going to throw Paul to the wolves. He just wanted to do the Jews a favor. Same trial, same judge, different venue. Kind of interesting that he would ask Paul if he was willing. But Paul was a Roman citizen and had certain rights. If Festus decided to hold the trial in Jerusalem, I really wonder if the Jewish leaders would have put someone on the fastest horse available to ride ahead to Jerusalem and get the 40 men ready again to carry out the ambush against Paul. We'll really never know, because as it turned out, the trial was not moved. Because Paul said, "No way." He said, "I stand in Caesar's court, and that's the appropriate place to hold my trial. A Roman citizen should be tried before Caesar's court, not in Jerusalem." He said, "I am not guilty of anything, as you are aware." Everyone knew that Paul was not guilty, including the Jewish leaders. And Paul said, "If I were guilty of death, I'd be willing to die." That's an extreme way of Paul claiming his innocence. And Paul said, "If the charges against me are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to my accusers." Paul knew that to do that would mean certain death. He'd already experienced poor treatment in Jerusalem by the Sanhedrin, and he was aware of the plot by the Sanhedrin to ambush and kill him. There was no way he was going to receive a fair trial in Jerusalem. And so Paul said, "I appeal to Caesar." Roman citizens had the right to appeal to Caesar's court. The emperor normally didn't personally hear these cases, but delegated them to others. Paul's trial before Festus took place in 59 AD. And the emperor at the time was Nero. And we know that Nero was an evil ruler who severely persecuted Christians. He had them seized and fed to lions. But Nero's horrible crimes against Christians started in 62 AD, 3 years after Paul's trial. At this time, Nero didn't appear to be such an evil ruler. So Paul believed that Nero, or one of Nero's judges, would judge his case fairly. Festus took a brief recess to decide Paul's request, and in his recess, he conferred with his council. A Roman judge normally had a council to confer with who were experts in the law. Although he conferred with them, he wasn't under any obligation to actually follow their counsel. Under normal circumstances, appeals were granted, so Paul would be going to Rome. Festus declared, "You have appealed to Caesar you will go." Festus was probably secretly relieved. In a short time, he'd come to see just what a sticky situation this trial presented. So by sending Paul to Rome, the Jews could not blame him if Caesar's court found him innocent. So what is our takeaway from this story? It is that it is our privilege to live for Christ before the world. When Paul defended himself before Festus, he said, "I have not done any wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well." So what was Paul charged with doing? Well, he was charged with disregarding Jewish law, with desecrating the Jewish temple, and inciting a rebellion against the government. And Paul knew the truth about himself. He knew that he had not disregarded Jewish law. He was a Christian, but he was still Jewish. And even when he was on his missionary journeys, he looked forward to getting back to Jerusalem to celebrate the major festivals, such as Pentecost and Passover. He also knew that he had not desecrated the temple by taking a Gentile into it. He was in the temple to worship and to support some Jewish men who were completing their vows. It's ironic that he was in the temple to prove his Jewishness, yet by being in the temple, he was peppered with false accusations of defiling it. Paul also knew that he had not stirred up a rebellion against Caesar. Paul respected the authorities, and realistically, he knew that the Roman government had actually protected him when his enemies attacked. And he was grateful to be a Roman citizen. He used his citizenship to his advantage several times in protecting his rights and his life. Well, not only did Paul know the truth about himself, Paul's accusers knew the truth about Paul. They knew that all the charges they brought against Paul were groundless. They could not produce witnesses to back up their claims. And their charge that he stirred up people to oppose the government were deliberate misrepresentations of his preaching, especially when Paul spoke about Christ's kingdom. And even Festus knew that Paul was innocent. By the time Paul stood trial, Festus was probably briefed on Paul's history. But even so, Festus knew a smokescreen when he saw it. He had to recognize that there was no real substance to the charges brought against Paul. The point is that Paul lived a transparent life. He had nothing to hide. There were no skeletons in the closet. He even spoke openly about how he used to persecute Christians, a subject that must have been uncomfortable for him. Paul lived for Christ. And just as Pilate could find no fault in Jesus, Paul's accusers can find no fault in Paul, at least not in the sense of him being guilty of a crime. And that's how we all should live before others. Lives that are honest and transparent. I read a portion of an article recently that told about some people who set up stationary video cameras to cover every square inch of their home, and they broadcast their lives, every bit of their lives, 24 hours a day. They even had cameras in their bathroom. Well, that's a bit much, isn't it? Even an honest, transparent life needs to have times of privacy. But the point is this: it is that our lives should be so transparent that if we lived in a house like that, just covered with cameras, and also had cameras following us every time we left the house, that those watching our behavior and listening to our conversations should find nothing incriminating about them. Our goal is to live for Christ, or more accurately, to have Christ live through us. By the life we live, the choices we make, the words we use, people should see Christ in us. That was Paul's goal, and that should be ours as well.